In this video, I want to talk about the subject of clean and unclean, and of cleanness and uncleanness. This is a subject that I think is often confused, or that does not appear to be very clear, especially whenever one is early on in their awareness of the Torah. This makes sense because uncleanness can be an entirely foreign concept. Of course, early on, we're likely aware of the fact that some animal species are clean and some animal species are unclean, but then we're also reading about how people can become unclean through things which are simply biological and natural, and we're also seeing that there can be such a thing as unclean objects, so naturally questions are going to arise. One might wonder about what the overlap is with these different clean and unclean situations, whether there's always sin to become unclean, and whether an animal from a clean species could possibly become unclean, or even what we should be doing about all of this. It can be a lot to process, especially if we don't really have a framework that we're working from. So in this video, I wanted to try to break the subject down and refer back to the language in the text itself. Because of the nature of this issue, I'm going to do things in kind of the reverse order from the way I normally do. I want to put these issues into useful categories and then go over some general ideas and questions regarding uncleanness. And then I want to go into the language and the text in more detail and provide references to the different contexts that these words appear in. And at that point, I invite you to delve further into those passages on your own. As far as the references to clean and unclean are concerned, and I will show the different contexts that these appear in shortly, but as a brief summary, I wanted to mention that there appears to be a difference in how animals are considered clean or unclean, as opposed to how people are considered clean or unclean, and how objects or other things are considered clean or unclean. If we just look at it as if everything is all the same thing and equal, I think that could lead to confusion. While there is some overlap, there are different ways that these categories are rendered clean or unclean, especially when it comes to something like clean or unclean animals. So we have these categories of animals, people, and of things, and one category could be treated uniquely and differently from the others. One thing I think we should note from the beginning is that there's no clear reference in the text to a live clean animal becoming an unclean animal. The way that it works with animals does not appear to be the same way that it works with humans. While something which is made from a clean animal could become unclean, as various verses refer to, the animal itself is inherently a clean animal or an unclean animal just by the nature of its species. If it's a clean species, it's a clean animal, regardless of whether it's diseased or lives in a bad environment or whatever the case may be. However, if it dies because of said disease, there are commands which address that as well as other issues, but it's not the same concept as clean and unclean. I think it's useful to view these issues of clean and unclean as being somewhat different depending on whether we are looking at clean or unclean animals as opposed to people or objects. This is a framework that I think is useful to keep in mind as we are considering this issue. Also, and this may seem odd when you first hear it, there is not a generalized command which tells us to not eat anything unclean. Certainly there are commands which say you should not eat certain things, such as unclean animals and also other things in certain circumstances. And there are commands that say that contact with those things can cause uncleanness. But there is not an explicit verse that says an unclean thing cannot be eaten. While it would be a problem if it was intended to be an offering, for example, as we will get into, there is not this generalized command, even though we might have initially assumed or expected there to be such. So clean and unclean, while it can relate to dietary laws, it can also be an independent subject from that. And since we are on that subject, as a final bit of an aside, something worth acknowledging is that not all of the dietary laws in the written commands of the law are isolated to clean or unclean either. It's easy to focus on the idea of clean and unclean animals, but there are also commands regarding the blood and the fat, even of clean animals. So this is something to be aware of. Getting into the overall subject of cleanness and uncleanness, one verse that I think is important appears near the end of Leviticus 15. If you want to read about this issue of clean and unclean in detail, you can read from Leviticus 11 to Leviticus 15 and see a big percentage of the information about this issue. At the end of that set of chapters, there's a reference to the tabernacle. The verse says, "And you shall warn the sons of Israel about their uncleanness, and they shall not die in their uncleanness, in their causing of my tabernacle to be unclean, which is in their midst." What I infer from this verse is that one reason for those laws regarding clean and unclean, especially with regard to people or objects becoming unclean, is because the sanctity of the tabernacle and the tent of meeting needs to be maintained, ensuring that it and the offerings given at it are essentially kept sacred and held according to strict standards. The tent of meeting is referred to as the house of God or the house of Elohim, and the offerings are referred to as his food. So many of these commands are just his standards regarding those things. By extension, that means maintaining the cleanness of the priests and the people that approach, and maintaining the cleanness of the offerings. That is not to say that this is the only reason, and I caution us about assuming too much as a result of that, but it does appear to be a big part of it because many of the commands are clearly related to this issue. The priests, if they are unclean, they're not allowed to approach or consume the holy things, the dedicated things which are presented from the people. Likewise, the law refers to certain offerings being destroyed if they come in contact with any uncleanness. Also in Deuteronomy 26, it refers to a person presenting an offering and making a declaration that seems to say, he did not take this offering out or remove it in an unclean state. So being clean or being unclean is clearly connected to, at least in some ways, the tent of meeting and everything associated with it. If people were just disregarding these issues of cleanness in terms of a person being unclean or grain being unclean or a water source or cooking implements being unclean, then certainly people would be making offerings or preparing offerings that would unknowingly be making contact with other people that were unclean, or they would be using things to prepare or present the offerings which may have been made unclean at some point. So the observance of these rules in the community would be essential to maintain the sanctity of the tent of meeting and the commanded offerings associated with it. Now normally I'm very hesitant to say anything about the supposed reason behind any command because normally whenever people hypothesize about why certain commands are given, it just comes down to making stuff up and guessing and unintentionally misleading people because the text does not actually explain most of the commands. But in the case I'm referring to, I'm basing my understanding of at least part of the reason for this on statements in the text in recognition of various commands about this issue. It is clear that there is a relationship between the issues of cleanness and the commanded holy place of the Torah. By extension of that, some might wonder, if it's really just about the tabernacle and the tent of meeting, then does that mean that the commands don't matter because the tent of meeting is not with us right now or it has not yet been rebuilt? I would say that regardless of what reason we perceive behind a command, it does not nullify the command. That's one reason I don't like the idea of focusing on why or focusing on what we think the reason might be, because that can unintentionally cause us to ignore what the law actually says. Certainly it is true right now that it's difficult to maintain cleanness, specifically with regard to uncleanness from the dead, as talked about in Numbers 19, which is a distinct form of uncleanness. Probably all of us at some point have been to a cemetery at the very least, and we may have made contact with a grave as a result, so that certainly could present an issue in terms of being clean today, because the means to resolve that type of uncleanness may not be accessible, as I will discuss later. That being said, as you read over the different passages in the Torah that speak regarding these issues of cleanness and becoming unclean, you will notice there are essentially two types of passages about how uncleanness can happen. There are commands which say, you shall not do this, you shall not do some certain thing, like, for example, not touching the carcass of an unclean beast. And then it also says, apart from that, that a person who does such a thing will become unclean. So we'll say that there is a thing we are commanded to not do, and then it will also say that uncleanness accompanies doing that thing. On the other hand, there are passages which say that doing a certain thing causes uncleanness, but it doesn't say that you shouldn't do it. For example, touching a carcass of a clean animal which died from a disease or something like that, you become unclean by doing that, but you are allowed to do it. There's not a command that says to not do it, and there's not any implication that we're not supposed to do it from a reference to punishment or something like that either. So the underlying issue of whether or not we are commanded to do or commanded to not do something is largely separate from whether or not the action itself causes uncleanness. Just the fact that it causes uncleanness does not mean that doing the thing is a violation, but if the law also says to not do that thing, then clearly it would be a violation to do that thing. With regard to this observation, I should add, as a caution to us, there are examples of things which one passage will tell you that it causes uncleanness, and another separate passage will say to not do that thing. So be aware of that. There may be another verse in an entirely different chapter that tells us more about a given issue. So this distinction between becoming unclean and violating a command gets into the question about whether uncleanness inherently implies sin. So just as I was referring to, some things can cause uncleanness even though they are not a violation of a command. I might mention as a bit of an aside, whenever I think about defining sin, I'm reminded of Numbers 15, 22 through 23, which talks about offerings for violating the law. And it specifies a violation of a person not doing all the commands which were given through Moses from the point he gave them and onward. Something I'll refer to later is the commands regarding the red heifer rituals described in Numbers 19. If you read those verses, you will see that the act of performing these commands can cause a person to become unclean. So we have examples of things which actually are commanded, and at the same time, they cause uncleanness. In my view, performing a command would be the opposite of sin. So if a person becomes unclean by performing this command, I would see that as a clear indication that becoming unclean does not automatically mean that one has sinned. So I would not assume that uncleanness means that one is in a state of sin or anything like that. However, that is not to say that one could not commit a sin as a result of being unclean. There are commands regarding a person not doing certain things while unclean, and there are commands about what a person should do if they are unclean, so that could still be relevant as far as any command that can be done. So going forward, I think it's useful to remember that there are differences between clean and unclean animals as opposed to clean and unclean humans and also objects. Also, we may want to remember the relevance, which is especially there with regard to the tent of meeting. Also, as we read, we will see that not every instance of uncleanness implies sin. Now I want to address the words which are translated as clean and unclean, cleanness and uncleanness, and so forth. I'm going to discuss these briefly and then go over the contexts that these appear in. Essentially, the subject of clean and unclean comes back to two root words. To start with, there's one verb which is used for being clean, making clean, declaring clean, cleansing, and from it we have words for pure and clean, and also a cleansing ritual. These words are used in a number of ways. Clean can simply mean clean or pure, even just in a clear physical sense, such as gold without impurities in it. It can refer to innocence or lack of defilement. Also, it can be used in a ritual sense, such as whether something is sacred, or referring to whether an animal species is acceptable to eat, or whether a human is in an acceptable state to approach an offering or approach the tent of meeting, the commanded holy place of the Torah. As you will see, there are a number of contexts which these three related words appear in. I'm not citing every single verse, but I wanted to cover how these words appear in the law, and I attempted to group them together in the process. As mentioned, we have references to pure gold, we have pure, clean, or sacred incense, and the articles of the tent of meeting, like the lampstand and the table. Also a designated clean or sacred place. We also have clean water and clean seed for sowing. Also, there are references to clean animals. There are some references in Deuteronomy 12 and otherwise that refer to clean and unclean people eating clean animals. And I know for a lot of people, including myself, this appeared to be kind of an awkward verse whenever we first saw it. But the verses refer to a person being able to eat meat which was not sacrificed, regardless of whether the person is clean or unclean. With regard to that, there are also references to people being declared clean, or being clean possibly in the sense of being not defiled, or being not clean from an incident through the night. With the verb, we have passages on how to cleanse objects which are unclean, such as a vessel, various articles, or even a house. There's the annual ritual of cleansing the altar. There's a reference to cleansing from sin, which is not the way the word is normally used in the Torah, but it does appear this way in Leviticus 16. Then there are a number of passages about people being cleansed or being declared clean, and the circumstances required for that, or the cause or the need for that. We have various skin diseases, issues of flow, which may refer to diseases like gonorrhea, abnormal bleeding, cleansing from eating an animal that died, or I would infer an animal that wasn't killed or slaughtered, or eating an animal which was preyed upon by another animal, both of these being something which native Israelites are forbidden from doing. And cleansing from contact with the dead. We also have some laws that are given regarding Aaron or Aharon and his sons, the commanded priests of the Torah, and they are not allowed to eat from the holy things or the offerings until they are clean. Also, we have the command of cleansing the Levites as they are offered to serve the service of the tent of meeting. Finally, this third word is apparently used for different cleansing rituals which apply to some of the contexts we looked at before, and also the Nazirite, or the one who took the vow of Nazir and came into contact with the dead. These are the different contexts for these words for clean and cleansing which are used in the law. Now with regard to the other side of things, we have the words surrounding unclean. The verb in question refers to being or becoming unclean or defiled, as well as making oneself or something else unclean or declaring it as unclean. Words related to that verb can refer to things which are unclean or defiled or defiling, also the state of being unclean. These are not just used in the sense of these ritually unacceptable states, but they are also used in other senses like morality or something being degraded in some sense. So we need to be aware that there are multiple ways that these words are used. Here are examples of different contexts and the commands for these words. As we might expect, we have references to unclean animals of various sorts, beasts and so forth, and we have reference to carcasses of unclean animals. Then there are references to things being made unclean, and with most of them it describes very specifically how they are being made unclean, like an oven and a stove, seed with water on it, garments or other articles, also an unclean house, and then a place outside the city which is unclean or otherwise designated as unclean. We have reference to a sacrifice which was touched with an unclean thing and how it is being destroyed. Then we have people that have become unclean, and they can be unclean by various physical issues or by coming into contact with certain types of uncleanness. Also of interest, we have that people are becoming unclean in relation to the red heifer ritual as described in Numbers 19, and this is a clear example of something which is commanded to be done but results in uncleanness being incurred. Then there's the aforementioned reference to being able to eat non-sacrificial meat even if the person is unclean, and a declaration which is being made by the one presenting offerings, which apparently states that the offering was not removed while the person was unclean. With the verb, we see a number of the same contexts appearing. We have unclean animals, then we have explanations about how a person can become unclean through handling animal carcasses, including clean animals that died on their own, so to speak. Then there are unclean carcasses making contact with different articles or things that can cause those things to become unclean. Then there are objects that can become unclean through other means, such as because of a person with the types of flows described in Leviticus 15. Objects in a house can become unclean because the priest declared the house to be unclean, which is an interesting passage because it shows that not all of this is necessarily an inherent physical or spiritual property, and feel free to check that out if you're curious. Then we have more discussion of people who are unclean or becoming unclean. This can extend into issues of normal sexual behavior. And then there are matters pertaining to the period and also the man becoming unclean because of lying with such a woman, something which is also forbidden to be done elsewhere in Leviticus 18:19. Then there's the issue of becoming unclean through the dead. There's also the red heifer ritual, which can cause one to become unclean in multiple ways. The priest that is unclean is not allowed to eat the holy things, and the people are warned or otherwise commanded to separate from their uncleanness so as not to defile the tabernacle, and likewise to prevent the people from defiling the camp at large, which has the tabernacle in the midst of it. The next verses seem to be a bit unique in that they may be using the word in a different sense rather than just the clean or unclean dynamic which we're discussing, but either way it is the same word. We have the verse about the man that has divorced his wife, and they are not allowed to be remarried if the woman has been defiled by another man after the divorce. There are references to prohibited sexual activity, which are referred to as causing defilement or causing uncleanness, and it's emphasized that this can also defile the land as a result. Similarly, there's a reference to people seeking the spirits of the dead and spirits of knowledge, or what might be called familiar spirits, and that causes defilement in some sense. There's also the giving from one's seed in Leviticus 20, which says it defiles the sanctuary. Finally, it refers to the land being defiled by blood through manslaughter or murder, and the land being defiled by leaving someone who is executed by hanging. With the last word in question, all these contexts have been looked at to some degree already, but I'll also point out Leviticus 16 refers to the annual covering or atonement of the uncleanness of Israel. So now we have a general awareness of the different contexts that these words appear in, and feel free to reference this list as you go about reading on your own. Having briefly gone over the different contexts for uncleanness, the last thing for now I wanted to discuss on this issue is how we're supposed to respond to uncleanness. With regard to people, depending upon how one becomes unclean, there are different ways that a person is supposed to address that. With the defilement by the dead, it requires a special ritual which may not be possible to do right now, at least by my awareness. Obviously, there is another possible difficulty with that because of a time frame which you can see applied to it. I assume that if the red heifer ash is recovered or created anew, then we would engage in that ritual from that point in time. That's largely covered in Numbers 19 if you're curious. With regard to other types of uncleanness for a human, most of the time it involves washing yourself and washing your clothes. Sometimes there are commands which only specify one or the other, but many of them specify both. As far as observance of these commands, some people essentially always try to maintain cleanness as much as possible, so a person might try to have always washed and such by sunset, and if they think they might have become unclean, and then keep the night clothing and the blanket or whatever clean. I do think this is the practical way to maintain cleanness, especially in the presence of the tabernacle. However, other than for the issues of the dead, I do not see a time frame being explicitly applied to when you're supposed to cleanse and such. So arguably it's not a requirement to be clean at the end of the day or anything like that in normal circumstances, and in some cases it's simply not practical or actually possible to do. That being said, I'm pretty sure that for a lot of people there is a tendency to just completely ignore or disregard the issue as a whole, and that's probably not the way to go about it, and certainly won't be the way to go about it in the future. Finally, there are some commands regarding carcasses falling on things such as pottery or cooking implements. I think there is some debate that could be had regarding which specific carcasses are being referred to in those passages. As you may notice, it's arguable there is a context for these commands which immediately precedes them, so feel free to check that out. Also, one could even consider the word for carcass as referring to an animal that just dies as opposed to an animal that was killed or slaughtered, at least in some contexts. So that could be relevant to that command also. With regard to all of that, with regard to what to do, I would say that if a command says to do something, then we should do it. As mentioned, in order to get a full awareness of the subject, you will want to look further into most of these passages that were mentioned. There are details, especially regarding certain unclean states, which I did not cover in any detail. There are also commands regarding what you're supposed to do or not supposed to do that are associated with those, and some of which are relevant right now, even though the tabernacle is not currently here. So feel free to go back and pause the video and look over the different passages that we mentioned. As mentioned, Leviticus 11 through Leviticus 15 is a good place to start looking, start reading. Also, Numbers 19 and Leviticus 22 are relevant, and there may be other passages such as the ones mentioned in the previous list too. So feel free to commit yourselves to checking that out further and looking into it as you can.